Hashtag she believed her twin daughters were gone. Until a human warrior arrived. Hashtag. First document. Mira Velda pressed her scaled palms against the cold metal of the observation deck's railing, watching the endless expanse of stars blur past the transport vessel's viewport. Her reflection stared back at her. Hollow amber eyes that had lost their shine months ago, violet skin dulled by grief, and the telltale marks of a Zephyrian mother who had lost her children. The twin scars on her neck, once symbols of pride when her daughters were born, now felt like brands of failure. The transport ship Nexus Dawn carried refugees from 17 different worlds, all fleeing the relentless advance of the Draconic Empire. Mira had managed to secure passage only because her late husband's military service entitled her to evacuation priority. Not that it mattered anymore. What was the point of survival when everything worth living for was gone? Another hyperspace jump in 30 minutes, announced Captain Korvac over the intercom, his gruff voice cutting through the murmur of displaced families. All passengers remain in designated areas. Mira barely registered the announcement. Her thoughts drifted back to that terrible day 3 months ago when the Draconic forces had descended upon Zephyr Prime like a plague of metal and fire. She could still hear the screams, still smell the acrid smoke that had choked the sky. Most of all, she could still see the last glimpse of her twin daughters, Lyra and Nova, as the evacuation transport lifted off without them. She had been forced to choose. The transport was under heavy fire, engines failing, and could only carry a fraction of the refugees waiting. The Zephyrian evacuation protocol was clear: adults first, then children if space permitted. Mira had been dragged aboard by evacuation officers while her 7-year-old daughters stood on the platform below, their small hands pressed against the transport bay's energy barrier. "We'll come back for them," the evacuation officer had promised. Next transport in 20 minutes. That next transport never came. The Draconic forces had overrun the spaceport 15 minutes later, and the subsequent orbital bombardment had reduced the entire city to ash and rubble. Mira had watched from the viewport as the surface of her homeworld burned, knowing that somewhere in those flames, her daughters had perished. Now, 3 months later, she existed in a state of hollow numbness. The other refugees had tried to console her at first, sharing their own stories of loss, but Mira had retreated into herself. She spoke only when necessary, ate only enough to survive, and spent her days staring out at the stars, wondering if she should have stayed behind with Lyra and Nova. The refugees around her represented a cross-section of the galaxy's displaced populations. There were the chittering insectoid families with their complex pheromone communications, the crystalline shard people whose bodies chimed softly when they moved, and the hulking Ursine traders whose fur had turned white from stress. All had lost homes. Many had lost family members, but somehow their grief seemed more manageable than hers. Perhaps it was because they still had someone left to protect, someone to give them purpose. Myra's attention was drawn to a commotion near the main passenger bay. A group of younger refugees had gathered around something, their excited voices creating a buzz of activity that seemed out of place on a ship full of the grieving and displaced. Curiosity, the first genuine emotion she'd felt in weeks, stirred within her. She made her way through the crowded corridors, past families huddled together in whatever space they could claim. The ship hadn't been designed for long-term passenger transport, and privacy was a luxury none of them could afford. Sleeping areas were marked by hanging blankets, and personal belongings arranged to create the illusion of separate spaces. As she approached the gathering, Mira heard fragments of excited conversation in Galactic Standard. Heard they took down an entire Draconic battalion, just one human against 50 Dragonborn warriors, rescuing prisoners from behind enemy lines. The crowd parted slightly, and Mira caught sight of what had captured everyone's attention. A holographic news feed was playing on a portable display unit, showing grainy combat footage from some distant battlefield. The image quality was poor, clearly recorded by military surveillance equipment under combat conditions, but the figure at the center of the action was unmistakable. A human warrior, standing no taller than average galactic height, was moving through what appeared to be a Draconic stronghold with fluid, deadly precision. The human wore advanced combat armor that seemed to shift and adapt to the environment, and carried weapons that fired with devastating accuracy. What struck Mira most wasn't the humans' fighting ability, impressive though it was, but the way they moved with clear purpose and determination. "Who is this human?" asked a young crystalline refugee, her voice creating harmonic overtones of curiosity. "They call him Marcus Kane," replied an elderly insectoid whose antenna twitched with excitement. "Been operating behind draconic lines for months. Look at this footage. He's single-handedly disrupting their supply lines and freeing prisoners." Mira watched as the human on the recording advanced through a draconic prison complex. Dragonborn guards, each standing nearly twice the human's height and armored in quantum-plated scales, fell before weapons that seemed impossibly advanced for such a small species. But what captured Myra's attention wasn't the combat effectiveness. It was what happened after each engagement. The human immediately began checking holding cells, methodically searching for prisoners. In one clip, they carried an unconscious Zephyrian child to safety. In another, they led a group of elderly Ursine civilians through what had clearly been a dangerous escape route. This wasn't just a warrior. This was someone who understood that victory meant more than defeating enemies. The reports say he's been specifically targeting facilities where they hold civilian prisoners, continued the insectoid. Especially children. The Draconics have been using them as leverage against resistance movements. A cold chill ran down Myra's spine. Children. The Draconics were keeping children alive as prisoners. For the first time in 3 months, a spark of something other than despair flickered in her chest. It wasn't hope. She couldn't allow herself that. But it was possibility. How reliable are these reports? She found herself asking, surprised by the sound of her own voice. The gathered refugees turned to look at her, and she realized this was the first time she'd voluntarily participated in any conversation since boarding the transport. The insectoid's compound eyes focused on her with surprising gentleness. "The footage comes from military reconnaissance networks," he said. "Multiple sources have confirmed the humans' activities across 7 different systems. The Galactic Resistance has been trying to establish contact, but he operates independently." Mira studied the holographic display more carefully. The timestamp on the footage was recent. Some clips were only days old. If this human was actively rescuing prisoners, if the Draconics were indeed keeping civilians alive for leverage, then perhaps. She forced herself to stop that train of thought. False hope will be more devastating than continued despair. But as she watched the human warrior's methodical approach to clearing each prison facility, she couldn't help but notice how thoroughly they searched every cell, every holding area. Someone that dedicated to rescue operations wouldn't overlook any possibility. The crowd began to disperse as the news feed moved on to other topics: supply shortages, refugee processing delays, political maneuvering among the remaining free worlds. But Mira remained, staring at the now empty holographic projector. For the first time since leaving Zephyr Prime, she felt something stirring within her that wasn't just the dull ache of loss. That night, as the transport continued its journey toward the refugee processing station at Harmony Base, Mira lay on her assigned sleeping pad, but found rest impossible. Around her, hundreds of other displaced beings sought whatever peace they could find in exhausted slumber, but her mind was racing with possibilities she'd thought were forever closed. She thought about Lyra and Nova, trying to remember every detail of their last conversation. Lyra had been excited about starting advanced mathematics classes when the school term resumed. Nova had been lobbying for permission to adopt a small creature they'd found in their garden, some kind of luminescent insect that created beautiful patterns when it flew. Normal childhood concerns that had seemed so important at the time. If they were alive, and she still couldn't quite allow herself to believe it was possible, they would be terrified and confused. They would be wondering why their mother hadn't come for them, why they were alone in some draconic detention facility light years from home. The thought of her daughters experiencing that kind of fear and abandonment made her chest tighten with a mixture of guilt and desperate determination. But there was something else growing alongside the pain, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since that terrible day. If there was even the smallest chance that Lyra and Nova were still alive, then she couldn't continue to drift aimlessly among the refugees. She had to do something. She had to try. The next morning brought another hyperspace jump and the announcement that they would reach Harmony Base within 2 standard days. Mira found herself seeking out the insectoid who had shared the news about the human warrior. His name was Click-Tor, and he had been a communications specialist before the war forced him to abandon his homeworld. "I need to know more about this human," she told him, settling beside him in a makeshift common area where refugees gathered to share meals and news. "How can someone get in contact with him?" Click-Tor's antennae twitched with concern. "You're thinking of something dangerous, Mira Veldar. I can see it in your posture, smell it in your pheromones. This human operates in the most dangerous territories in the galaxy." "My daughters might be in one of those territories," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "If there's any chance they're still alive, I have to explore it." "The probability is extremely low," Click-Tor said gently. "The Draconics rarely keep Zephyrian children as prisoners. Your people's empathic abilities make them difficult to control. But not impossible to control," Mira countered. "And you said yourself that they've been using children as leverage. What better leverage than empathic children who can sense their captor's intentions?" Click-Tor was quiet for a long moment, his compound eyes reflecting the soft lighting of the common area. Around them, other refugees continued their quiet conversations. Children played simple games with improvised toys, and the gentle hum of the ship's engines provided a constant backdrop to their displaced lives. "There are ways to reach out to the resistance networks," he finally admitted. "Unofficial channels, encrypted communication protocols that route through multiple systems. But understand, even if you could somehow contact this human, what then? You're a civilian, Mira. You have no combat training, no intelligence to offer, nothing that would convince a warrior to divert from their mission to search for 2 children among millions of prisoners." "Then I'll find another way," she said. "I'll go myself if I have to." "That's suicide," Click-Tor replied bluntly. "You'd be captured within hours of entering Draconic territory. Or worse, you'd be killed outright. How does that help your daughters?" Mira didn't have an answer for that. She only knew that she couldn't continue existing in this state of passive despair. For 3 months, she had been dying slowly, letting grief consume her one day at a time. If there was any possibility that Lyra and Nova needed her, she had to try to reach them, even if it meant leaving the safety of the refugee ships and venturing into the war zone. As the day progressed, Mira found herself paying closer attention to the conversations around her. She learned that several of the refugees had connections to resistance movements, that there were indeed underground networks dedicated to rescuing prisoners and disrupting Draconic operations. Most importantly, she learned that these networks were always in need of volunteers, even civilians willing to take on support roles. The idea that had been forming in her mind began to take clearer shape. She couldn't fight like the human warrior in the recordings, but she could contribute to the rescue operations in other ways. Her background in Zephyrian social services had given her experience with child psychology and trauma response. Her empathic abilities, while not as strong as some of her people, could still be useful for identifying emotional states and detecting deception. More than anything, she had motivation that wouldn't waver. Other volunteers might lose heart when missions became dangerous or when the chances of success seemed slim. But for someone searching for her own children, no mission would be too dangerous, no odds too overwhelming. That evening, as the ship prepared for its final hyperspace jump to Harmony Base, Mira made her decision. She would volunteer for the resistance networks. She would find a way to contribute to the rescue operations. And somehow, she would discover the truth about what had happened to Lyra and Nova. The last thing she saw before the jump engaged was the reflection of stars streaking past the viewport, stretching into lines of light that seemed to point toward an uncertain, but no longer hopeless future. For the first time in months, Mira Veldar fell asleep with something other than despair in her heart. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new dangers, and perhaps the first real chance she'd had to honor the promise she'd made to herself, that she would never stop searching for her daughters, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. Hashtag second document Harmony Base sprawled across the surface of an artificial moon, its gleaming domes and towers a testament to galactic cooperation in more peaceful times. Now it served as the largest refugee processing center in the outer spiral, housing nearly 2 million displaced beings from dozens of worlds. As the Nexus Dawn docked at one of the massive receiving ports, Mira pressed her face to the viewport and marveled at the sheer scale of organized displacement. The processing took 6 hours. 6 hours of standing in lines, answering questions from overworked officials, submitting to medical scans, and receiving temporary identification credentials. Mira found herself assigned to Residential Block 7, a section designed for unattached adults awaiting relocation opportunities. The accommodations were basic but clean: a small private room with a bed, storage unit, and access to communal facilities. But Mira wasn't interested in comfort or long-term planning. As soon as the orientation session ended, she began asking questions about volunteer opportunities. The Zephyrian liaison officer, a middle-aged woman named Sarah who had lost her own husband in the war, initially tried to steer her toward traditional refugee services. "We have excellent counseling programs," Sarah explained as they sat in her cramped office overlooking the residential districts. "And there are vocational training opportunities. Your background in social services would transfer well to several peacetime careers." "I'm not interested in peacetime careers," Mira replied. "I want to know about resistance activities. I want to help with rescue operations." Sarah's expression grew carefully neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean. Harmony Base is a humanitarian facility, not a military installation." But Mira had spent years reading people's emotional states, both professionally and through her natural Zephyrian empathy. She could sense Sarah's discomfort, could detect the careful way she was choosing her words. This was someone who knew more than she was saying. "My daughters might still be alive," Mira said quietly. "If there's any chance they're being held prisoner somewhere, I need to be part of the effort to find them." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying Mira's face. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its official tone. "There are unofficial networks," she admitted. "People who coordinate with independent operators to gather intelligence and support rescue missions. But, Mira, you have to understand that these activities are extremely dangerous. Most of the time, they don't result in successful rescues. More often, they result in more casualties. I understand the risks." "Do you?" Sarah leaned forward, her amber eyes intense. "Because I've seen what happens when grief clouds judgment. I've seen desperate parents volunteer for suicide missions because they couldn't accept loss. The resistance networks can't afford to take on people who aren't thinking clearly." The criticism stung, but Mira recognized the truth in it. She had been operating on raw emotion since seeing that news footage of the human warrior. If she was going to contribute meaningfully to any rescue operation, she needed to approach this rationally. "What would it take to convince them I'm thinking clearly?" she asked. Sarah seemed surprised by the question. She had probably expected anger or defensive arguments. Instead, she was getting someone willing to listen and adapt. "Prove that you have skills they need," Sarah said. "Show that you understand the realities of what you're volunteering for. And demonstrate that you can function effectively even when emotionally invested in the outcome." "Ow!" "There's a training program," Sarah said slowly, as if still deciding whether to reveal this information. "Not officially connected to any resistance activities, you understand. It's listed as emergency response preparation in our volunteer database. But the people who run it, they have connections to various independent operators." Mira felt her pulse quicken. "Where do I sign up?" "Block 15, Training Center C. Ask for Commander Thorne." "But, Mira," Sarah's voice carried a warning. "Don't mention your personal motivations when you talk to him. Prove your competence first. The Resistance can't afford to accommodate people who are there for personal reasons rather than the larger cause." That afternoon, Mira made her way through Harmony Base's sprawling complex to Training Center C. The facility was larger than she'd expected, with multiple training halls, equipment storage areas, and what appeared to be sophisticated simulation chambers. The people moving through the corridors had a different bearing than the typical refugees, more alert, more purposeful, more military in their posture. Commander Thorne turned out to be a battle-scarred Ursine whose massive frame was crisscrossed with old injury marks. His office was spartanly furnished, but for one wall covered with star charts showing current conflict zones. Red markers indicated known draconic strongholds, while blue ones marked areas of resistance activity. "Sarah tells me you're interested in emergency response training," Thorne said without preamble. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to resonate through his massive chest. "What makes you think you're qualified?" Mira had prepared for this question during the walkover. I have 10 years of experience in crisis intervention and trauma response. I'm trained in conflict de-escalation, psychological assessment under stress, and emergency medical assistance. My empathic abilities allow me to assess emotional states and detect deception, which could be valuable for intelligence gathering. Thorne grunted, consulting a datapad. Says here you've been in a refugee camp for 3 months. No recent field experience. No combat training. No intelligence background. What you've described are civilian skills that might be useful in a support role, but emergency response work requires people who can function under extreme stress. Test me, Mira said simply. Something in her tone made Thorne look up from his datapad. His small, dark eyes studied her with the intensity of someone accustomed to making quick judgments about people's capabilities. Training starts tomorrow at 0600, he said finally. 2-week intensive program. Physical conditioning, tactical awareness, intelligence gathering, emergency medical protocols, and psychological resistance techniques. 24 candidates started last week. 11 have already washed out. If you're not serious about this, don't waste my time or theirs. I'm serious. We'll see. The next 14 days were the most physically and mentally demanding of Myra's life. The training program, she quickly realized, was definitely not focused on typical emergency response scenarios. The scenarios they practiced involved operating behind enemy lines, extracting information from hostile sources, and maintaining psychological stability under extreme duress. Her fellow trainees came from a dozen different species and backgrounds, but they all shared certain characteristics. They were intelligent, motivated, and had personal reasons for wanting to strike back at the Draconic Empire. There was Zura, a crystalline engineer whose homeworld had been stripped of its resonant minerals, Kaith, a young insectoid whose entire hive cluster had been enslaved, and Marcus, not the human warrior from the news footage, but a human named Marcus Chun who had been a military communications specialist before his unit was overrun. The physical training was brutal. Commander Thorne pushed them through combat conditioning exercises designed to build strength, speed, and endurance across multiple species physiologies. Mira discovered muscles she hadn't known existed and learned to ignore pain levels that would have sent her to medical services in her previous life. But the psychological training was even more challenging. They were subjected to interrogation scenarios, isolation exercises, and stress simulations that pushed several candidates to their breaking points. Mira found herself drawing on her background in crisis counseling, but applying those skills to herself rather than to clients. The turning point came during a simulation exercise on day 10. The scenario involved infiltrating a simulated Draconic detention facility to extract intelligence about prisoner locations. Mira and 3 other trainees were inserted into a complex mock-up environment with live-action opponents playing Draconic guards. The mission went wrong almost immediately. One of their team members triggered a security alert, and they found themselves pinned down in a corridor with no apparent escape route. 2 of her teammates began to panic, their training failing them under the intense pressure of the simulation. Mira found herself taking charge, using her empathic abilities to assess the emotional states of both her teammates and their opponents. She realized that one of the guards was positioned more tentatively than the others, suggesting uncertainty. Rather than attempting a direct assault, she guided her team through a tactical withdrawal that exploited that guard's hesitation. More importantly, when they reached a section of the facility designed to simulate prisoner holding areas, Mira demonstrated the methodical approach needed for intelligence gathering. While her teammates focused on the tactical situation, she carefully examined each simulated cell, noting details about occupancy, security measures, and potential extraction routes. Commander Thorne was waiting for them when the simulation ended. "Veldar," he said, "stay behind. The rest of you, debrief in conference room 2. When they were alone, Thorne studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Interesting approach in there," he said. "Your teammates were focused on completing the mission as defined. You were thinking about what would come after mission completion. Intelligence gathering isn't much use if you can't act on what you discover," Mira replied. "True, but most people in your position would have been thinking about one specific objective. You approached it like someone planning for multiple contingencies." He paused. "Sarah mentioned you have personal reasons for wanting to participate in rescue operations." Myra's heart sank. She had tried so hard to keep her personal motivations separate from her training performance. I do, she admitted. But I hope I've demonstrated that I can function professionally despite those motivations. You have, which is why I'm going to ask you a question, and I want a completely honest answer. Thorne's expression grew serious. If you were assigned to a rescue operation and discovered that your personal objectives were incompatible with the mission's primary goals, what would you do? The question cut straight to the heart of her fears about herself. If she found evidence that Lyra and Nova were being held at a different facility than the one her team was assigned to rescue, would she abandon her teammates to pursue her daughters? If she had to choose between saving her children and saving a larger group of prisoners, which would she prioritize? I don't know, she said honestly. I want to say I'd prioritize the mission, but I can't be certain I would. That's why I need to be part of operations where my personal objectives align with the mission goals. Thorne nodded slowly. That's the most honest answer I've received to that question in 5 years of training programs. Most people claim they'd always prioritize the mission, but they're lying to themselves. Your self-awareness actually makes you more trustworthy, not less. He moved to the wall of star charts, pointing to several areas marked with blue indicators. There's a particular independent operator who's been requesting support personnel for reconnaissance missions in the Kepler sector, he said. Someone with your psychological assessment skills and empathic abilities would be useful for evaluating rescued prisoners, determining their mental state, identifying potential intelligence sources, detecting whether they might be draconic plants. Myra's breath caught. The Kepler sector included the system where Zephyr Prime had been located. The operator in question has been specifically focusing on facilities where civilian prisoners are being held, Thorne continued, particularly children. The working theory is that the Draconics are using them as psychological leverage against resistance movements. Is this the human warrior? Mira asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I can't discuss operational details, Thorne replied. But if you're interested in the assignment, I can arrange an introduction. The final decision would be up to the operator in question, not me. I'm interested. Then, pack your gear. Transport leaves tomorrow at 1,400 hours. You'll be briefed on the details during transit. That night, Mira lay in her small room, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. In 2 weeks, she had gone from a grieving refugee to someone being considered for active resistance operations. The rational part of her mind warned that this was moving too fast, that she was letting hope override caution. But another part of her, the part that had been slowly dying for 3 months, felt truly alive for the first time since leaving Zephyr Prime. Tomorrow, she would begin the journey toward answers, toward the possibility of reunion, toward the chance to become more than just another casualty of war. She thought about Lyra and Nova, trying to send them a message across the vast distances of space through whatever connection might still exist between them. Hold on, she thought. I'm coming. I'm finally coming. Outside her small window, the stars that had seemed cold and distant just weeks ago now appeared like waypoints on a map leading home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new possibilities. But for the first time since that terrible day on Zephyr Prime, Mira Velder felt like she was moving toward something rather than away from everything she had lost. Third document, the transport ship Silent Runner was nothing like the refugee vessels Mira had grown accustomed to. Built for stealth rather than passenger comfort, it moved through space with the quiet efficiency of a predator. The corridors were narrow, the lighting kept to minimal levels, and every surface seemed designed to absorb rather than reflect energy signatures. Mira shared the cramped passenger compartment with 5 other volunteers, all veterans of previous resistance operations. They spoke in quiet voices about people and places she didn't recognize, using terminology that highlighted her status as a newcomer to this shadow war. But they accepted her presence without question. Commander Thorne's recommendation carried significant weight in these circles. The journey to the operational staging area took 4 days, during which Mira received her first real briefing on the human warrior she would be supporting. His name was Marcus Kane, and his background was unlike anything she had expected. Kane wasn't military before the war started, explained Dr. Yill, a Shard person who served as the team's intelligence specialist. Her crystalline form chimed softly as she manipulated holographic displays, showing personnel files and mission reports. He was what humans call an extreme sports athlete, someone who pursued dangerous recreational activities for personal satisfaction. The concept seemed bizarre to Mira. Why would anyone deliberately seek out life-threatening situations for entertainment? When the Draconics began their expansion into human space, Kane volunteered for experimental enhancement programs. Dr. Yill continued. Humans have an unusual physiological response to certain bioaugmentation techniques. Where other species experience rejection or systemic failure, humans adapt and integrate the modifications. The holographic display shifted to show medical scans and performance assessments. Kane's enhanced capabilities were impressive even by galactic military standards, but what caught Myra's attention was the psychological profile included in his file. Subject demonstrates exceptional focus when pursuing rescue objectives, she read aloud. Tactical flexibility combined with strategic persistence. Willing to accept extreme personal risk when civilian lives are at stake. He's been operating behind Draconic lines for 8 months, added Vex, a young insectoid communications specialist. 37 confirmed rescue operations. Over 400 civilian prisoners extracted. But here's what makes him unusual. He's never abandoned a search once he's committed to it. Mira felt a chill of recognition. That level of persistence, the unwillingness to give up on rescue operations, sounded like someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and refused to accept that loss. What's a success rate for finding specific individuals? She asked, trying to keep her voice professionally neutral. That's complicated, Dr. Yill replied. Her harmonic tones carried a note of uncertainty. Kane doesn't operate with traditional mission parameters. He gathers intelligence, identifies prisoner locations, and then systematically clears every facility he can reach. The resistance networks provide him with lists of priority targets, but his approach is more comprehensive than selective. You mean he tries to rescue everyone he can find, not just specific high-value targets? Exactly, which is why his operations take longer than traditional military rescues, but also why his overall success rate is so high. He doesn't leave survivors behind if he can avoid it. The transport dropped out of hyperspace in a system Mira didn't recognize, just a designation number on the navigation charts. The staging area turned out to be a heavily modified asteroid mining station, its surface bristling with sensor arrays and defensive installations. According to the briefing materials, it served as a forward operating base for resistance activities throughout this sector. Kane was waiting for them in the station's main briefing room, and Myra's first impression was how ordinary he appeared. The news footage had shown him in full combat gear, moving with lethal efficiency through hostile environments. In person, he was of average human height and build with brown hair and gray eyes that seemed constantly alert but not hostile. He wore simple utility clothing and carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone comfortable in dangerous situations. Dr. Yill says you have experience with trauma assessment, he said without preamble as the team gathered around a holographic display table. I need someone who can quickly evaluate rescued prisoners to determine their physical and mental condition, identify potential intelligence sources, and detect whether any of them might be compromised. I can do that, Mira replied. But I want to understand your operational approach first. How do you decide which facilities to target? Kane's expression didn't change, but she sensed a shift in his attention, as if he was evaluating her more carefully. Intelligence gathering happens in layers, he said, manipulating the holographic display to show a three-dimensional map of a local stellar region. First, we identify systems where prisoner facilities are likely to exist based on draconic operational patterns. Then, we investigate those systems to locate actual installations. Finally, we gather specific intelligence about security measures, prisoner populations, and extraction possibilities. Red markers appeared on the display, indicating known or suspected draconic facilities. There were dozens of them scattered across multiple star systems. The challenge is that the Draconics move prisoners frequently, Kane continued. A facility that holds 50 civilians this week might be empty next week, or might suddenly house 500 military prisoners instead. Real-time intelligence is critical. Mira studied the display, noting that several of the red markers were clustered around systems near her former homeworld. How do you gather real-time intelligence without revealing your presence to Draconic security forces. Carefully, Kane replied with what might have been a slight smile, and with a lot of patience. Most resistance operations fail because they move too quickly before they fully understand the tactical situation. My approach is to spend as much time as necessary gathering intelligence before committing to any rescue attempt. That must be frustrating, Vex commented, knowing there are prisoners who need immediate help while you're conducting surveillance. It would be more frustrating to get captured or killed because I rushed into a situation I didn't understand, Kane replied. Dead rescuers don't save anyone. The practicality of his response impressed Mira, but she also sensed something deeper, a level of control and discipline that suggested powerful emotions held in check. Someone who cared enough about rescue operations to risk his life repeatedly, but who had learned to channel that caring into effective action rather than reckless heroism. What's our first target? She asked. Kane highlighted one of the red markers, showing a facility in the Tau Ceti system. Long-range reconnaissance has identified a medium-security installation here that appears to be housing civilian prisoners. Mixed species, including children. We have intelligence suggesting they've been there for approximately 3 months. 3 months. The timeline made Myra's pulse quicken, but she forced herself to focus on the tactical discussion. But part of her mind was calculating distances and transit times, wondering if it was possible that prisoners from Zephyr Prime could have been transported to this facility. Veldar, Kane said, and she realized he had been speaking to her. Asked about your assessment protocols. Sorry, she said, struggling to regain focus. Can you repeat the question? Kane's gray eyes studied her with uncomfortable intensity. I need to know how quickly you can evaluate a large number of prisoners during an extraction operation. Time will be critical once we're inside the facility. It depends on what information you need, she replied. Basic physical condition and immediate medical needs I can assess visually in seconds per individual. Psychological state and potential intelligence value would take longer, a few minutes of direct interaction per person. What about identifying specific individuals? Kane asked. If we had names or descriptions of prisoners we were looking for, how quickly could you determine whether they were present? The question caught her off guard. Was he asking in general terms, or had he somehow learned about her personal motivations? Visual identification would be immediate, assuming I knew what they looked like, she said carefully. Psychological identification, confirming that someone claiming to be a specific person wasn't compromised or coerced, would take longer. Kane nodded, but she had the distinct impression he was filing away more information than her words had conveyed. Either he was exceptionally perceptive, or Commander Thorne had shared more background than she'd expected. The briefing continued for another hour, covering communication protocols, emergency extraction procedures, and contingency planning. When the team dispersed to their individual preparation areas, Kane approached Mira privately. "Walk with me," he said, leading her toward one of the station's observation decks. The deck overlooked the asteroid field where the station was hidden, with chunks of rock and metal drifting slowly past the reinforced windows. In the distance, Mira could see the modified mining equipment that helped disguise the base's true purpose. Commander Thorne mentioned you have personal reasons for volunteering for rescue operations, Kane said without looking at her. Mira felt her stomach clench. I hope that doesn't disqualify me from the mission. On the contrary, it helps me understand your motivation. But I need to know what those personal reasons are if we're going to work together effectively. She had known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier. I have twin daughters, she said quietly. 7 years old. They were on Zephyr Prime when the Draconics invaded. I was evacuated, but they weren't. I believe they were killed in the orbital bombardment, but recent intelligence suggests the Draconics might be keeping children alive as prisoners. Kane was quiet for a long moment, watching the asteroids drift past. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tone she hadn't heard before, gentler, but also more serious. Hope is a dangerous thing in this business, he said. It can make you take unnecessary risks, or it can keep you functional when everything else says you should give up. The key is learning how to use it without letting it use you. Do you think I'm making a mistake being here? I think you're here for the right reasons, Kane replied. But I also think you need to understand that most rescue operations don't end the way we hope they will. Sometimes we find the people we're looking for. Sometimes we find evidence of what happened to them. And sometimes we never find anything at all. The honesty of his response was both painful and reassuring. He wasn't offering false comfort or unrealistic promises, but he also wasn't dismissing her hopes as foolish. "Can you work effectively if we don't find what you're looking for?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and realized she meant it. "Because even if we don't find my daughters, we might find someone else's children, and that would still matter." Kane nodded, and she sensed approval in his posture. "Then, we understand each other. Mission preparation begins tomorrow at 0600. Get some rest. The next few days are going to be challenging." That night, Mira lay in her assigned quarters thinking about the conversation. Kane's approach to hope, using it without being used by it, resonated with something she had been struggling to articulate. For months, she had been trapped between despair and desperate fantasy, unable to find a middle ground that allowed for possibility without demanding certainty. Perhaps that middle ground was action itself. Perhaps hope was most useful not as an emotion to be felt, but as a fuel for effort to be expended. She could search for her daughters without requiring guarantees that she would find them. She could work toward reunion while accepting that it might never happen. Outside her small window, the asteroid field continued its slow dance around the hidden base. Somewhere in the vast darkness beyond, prisoners waited in draconic detention facilities, not knowing if anyone was coming for them. Tomorrow, she would begin the real work of finding out who those prisoners were and whether any of them were the two small girls who had been forced to watch their mother's transport leave without them. For the first time since this journey began, Mira fell asleep without the weight of impossible expectations pressing down on her chest. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, and she would be ready for it. Fourth document, the reconnaissance mission to the Tau Ceti facility took 3 weeks, and it taught Mira more about patience than any formal training program could have. Kane's approach to intelligence gathering was methodical to the point of obsession, involving multiple observation posts, detailed behavioral analysis of guard personnel, and careful mapping of every security system and potential vulnerability. From their concealed position on the rim of the system's outer asteroid belt, Mira watched Kane work with growing respect and understanding. He didn't just observe the target facility. He studied it with the intensity of someone preparing for a complex surgical procedure. Every guard rotation was timed down to the minute. Every supply transport was tracked and analyzed. Even the facility's waste disposal patterns were recorded and evaluated for tactical significance. "Most people think rescue operations are about fighting," Kane explained during one of their long surveillance shifts. They were alone in the observation post, monitoring long-range sensors while Dr. Yill and the others maintained communication protocols at their mobile command center. But fighting is what happens when everything else has failed. Real rescue work is about information, timing, and preparation. Through the observation port, the draconic detention facility looked like a small city built into the surface of an airless moon. Defensive towers ringed the perimeter, energy barriers shimmed between guard posts, and the constant movement of patrol vehicles created patterns that Kane had been mapping for days. "How many prisoners do you estimate are held there?" Mira asked, studying the facility through high-magnification scopes. "Based on supply transport analysis and facility dimensions, somewhere between 300 and 500 individuals," Kane replied. "Mixed species, with approximately 20% being children based on the type and quantity of nutritional supplements being delivered." 20% children. That meant potentially 100 young prisoners in the facility below them. Mira had to force herself not to scan every face visible in the outer exercise areas, looking for familiar features that couldn't possibly be resolved at this distance. "The challenge is going to be processing that many people during extraction," Kane continued. "Even under optimal conditions, we can't evacuate everyone simultaneously. We'll need to prioritize based on medical condition, intelligence value, and security risk." Security risk? "The Draconics sometimes place compromised prisoners among legitimate captives," Kane explained. "Individuals who've been turned, or who are actually Draconic agents posing as prisoners. They use them to gather intelligence about resistance activities and to identify rescue attempts." The possibility hadn't occurred to Mira, and it added another layer of complexity to an already challenging operation. "How do you identify compromised prisoners?" "That's where your skills become critical," Kane said. Your empathic abilities should allow you to detect deception or coercion that wouldn't be obvious through conventional interrogation. But you'll need to make those assessments quickly under combat conditions. Over the following days, Mira practiced rapid psychological assessment techniques, while Kane finalized the operational plan. The facility's security was formidable, but not impenetrable. Kane had identified a 12-minute window during the night shift rotation when a coordinated assault could breach the perimeter and reach the main prisoner housing areas. 12 minutes to get in, locate, and assess the prisoners, identify extraction priorities, and begin the evacuation process, Kane summarized during their final planning session. After that, draconic reinforcements will arrive, and we'll be fighting a running battle while trying to protect hundreds of civilians. Dr. Yill's crystalline form chimed with harmonics of concern. The risk assessment for this operation is considerably higher than our previous missions. Are we certain the intelligence justifies the danger level? Kane was quiet for a moment, studying the holographic facility schematics. Intelligence suggests this facility contains prisoners from multiple worlds that fell during the early expansion phase, he said finally, including Zephyr Prime, Crystal Lys Minor, and the insectoid colonies in the Vega system. Some of these people have been held for months. If we don't extract them now, they'll likely be transferred to higher security installations where rescue becomes virtually impossible. Mira felt her pulse quicken. Prisoners from Zephyr Prime. The logical part of her mind warned against reading too much into that information, but she couldn't completely suppress the surge of hope. When do we move? She asked. Tomorrow night, Kane replied. Final equipment check in 6 hours. Departure in 18 hours. Insertion in 36 hours. The team spent the rest of the day in final preparations. Mira checked and rechecked her medical assessment equipment, communication gear, and the portable psychological evaluation protocol she had developed during their surveillance period. Everything had to be compact and efficient. She would be working in a combat zone with limited time and resources. But as evening approached, she found herself struggling with doubts that had nothing to do with operational preparedness. For months, she had been building toward this moment, driven by the possibility that Lyra and Nova might still be alive. Now, faced with the reality of an imminent rescue operation, she was forced to confront what would happen if they weren't among the prisoners they found. Kane found her in the observation post during the final hours before departure, staring out at the draconic facility where lights moved in regular patterns as the night shift took over guard duties. Second thoughts? He asked, settling beside her at the observation station. Not about the mission, Mira replied, but about myself. I keep wondering if I'll be able to function professionally if my daughters aren't down there, or if they are, but they're not okay. Kane was quiet for several minutes, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of personal experience. I started doing rescue operations because my younger sister was captured during the fall of Alpha Centauri, he said. Spent the first 6 months searching for intelligence about what happened to her, following every lead, investigating every facility where she might have been taken. Mira turned to look at him, surprised by this revelation. In all their time together, Kane had never mentioned personal motivations for his work. Did you find her? She asked gently. I found what was left of her, Kane replied. 3 months after capture, in a facility not unlike the one we're about to infiltrate. The Draconics had been using her as a test subject for psychological conditioning experiments. She was alive, but not herself anymore. The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakable. I'm sorry. The point is, Kane continued, I learned that rescue operations can't be about recovering the past. They have to be about saving whoever can be saved, in whatever condition we find them. Your daughters might be in that facility. They might not. If they are, they might be exactly as you remember them, or they might be changed by their experiences. Either way, your job tomorrow is to help save everyone we can reach. What are you doing? Mira asked. How do you keep working these missions knowing that most of the time, you don't find what you're looking for? Kane gestured toward the facility below them, where hundreds of imprisoned beings waited for a rescue that might never come. Because sometimes we do find what we're looking for, he said. And because every person we save is someone's daughter or son, parent or sibling. The specific individuals might not be the ones we started searching for, but they matter just as much to someone. The wisdom of his perspective settled into Myra's understanding like a missing piece of a complex puzzle. She had been so focused on the possibility of finding Lyra and Nova that she had lost sight of the broader purpose, to ease suffering and restore freedom wherever possible. "Thank you," she said. "I needed to hear that." "Good. Now get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." The assault began exactly as Kane had planned. Using stealth technology borrowed from various resistance networks, their small team approached the facility during the optimal window between guard rotations. Kane moved through the perimeter defenses like they were a minor inconvenience, his enhanced capabilities allowing him to disable security systems and neutralize guards with efficiency that seemed almost casual. Mira followed close behind, her heart hammering as they made their way through corridors that looked exactly like the intelligence reports had indicated. The facility's design was coldly functional. Long hallways lined with holding cells, minimal lighting, and an atmosphere of institutionalized despair. The first group of prisoners they encountered was a mixed collection of adults from various species, all showing signs of malnutrition and psychological stress. Mira moved through them quickly, assessing physical condition and identifying those who would need immediate medical attention during evacuation. 23 individuals, 7 requiring immediate medical support, 3 showing signs of severe psychological trauma, she reported through her communication link. "No obvious security risks detected, but I need more time for complete assessment." "Keep moving," Kane replied from his position at the corridor entrance. "We have 9 minutes before the next guard rotation." They continued deeper into the facility, finding more prisoners in various stages of physical and mental deterioration. Myra's training took over, allowing her to function despite the emotional impact of seeing so much suffering. Each person she evaluated became a tactical consideration: medical needs, transportation requirements, potential intelligence value. But it wasn't until they reached the facility's 3rd level that she found what she had been hoping and dreading to discover. The children's section was smaller than the adult areas, but it held nearly 40 young prisoners from multiple species. They huddled together in small groups, their eyes reflecting the particular kind of fear that comes from prolonged captivity without understanding the reasons for their imprisonment. Mira scanned the faces systematically, forcing herself to be thorough rather than searching frantically for specific features. Insectoid younglings with dimmed bioluminescence. Crystalline children whose normally resonant voices had been reduced to whispers. Ursine cubs who should have been learning to hunt, but instead cowered against cell walls. And in the far corner of the largest holding area, she saw them. Lyra and Nova sat close together, their violet Zephyrian skin pale from months without proper sunlight, their once bright amber eyes now carrying shadows that no 7-year-old should possess. They were alive, conscious, and appear to be physically unharmed, but the psychological impact of their captivity was immediately apparent. The surge of emotion that hit Mira threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. Every instinct screamed at her to run to them, to gather them in her arms, and never let go. But Kane's training held her in check. She was in a combat zone with responsibilities to dozens of other prisoners who needed her assessment and protection. "Kane," she said quietly into her communication link, "I found my daughters. They appear to be in stable condition, but I need a moment to evaluate them properly." "Take the time you need," Kane replied. "But remember that everyone here is someone's child." The reminder helped her regain focus. She moved through the children's area systematically, assessing each young prisoner's condition and marking those who would need priority evacuation. Only when she had completed the professional requirements did she allow herself to approach Lyra and Nova directly. They looked up at her with the wariness of children who had learned not to trust adult strangers. For a heart-stopping moment, Mira thought they might not recognize her. 3 months was a significant portion of their young lives, and trauma could affect memory in unpredictable ways. Then Nova whispered, "Mama." The sound of her daughter's voice, weak but unmistakably real, nearly broke Myra's carefully maintained composure. She knelt beside them, fighting back tears that would serve no tactical purpose. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "Mama's here. I'm going to get you out of here." "We knew you would come," Lyra said, her voice carrying the particular certainty that Zephyrian children often displayed. We could feel that you were getting closer. Their empathic connection, Mira realized. Even across the vast distances of space and the psychological barriers created by their captivity, some link between them had remained intact. It sensed her approach just as she had been drawn to search for them. "Are you hurt?" she asked, quickly checking them for obvious injuries while maintaining professional awareness of the tactical situation around them. "Not hurt," Nova replied, "but scared and hungry. And the guards don't like it when we use our abilities to talk to each other." Mira felt a flash of anger at the casual cruelty of suppressing empathic communication in young Zephyrians, but she pushed the emotion aside. There would be time for anger later, after everyone was safe. "Can you walk?" she asked. "We need to move quickly, and I need you to stay close to me and do exactly what I say." Both girls nodded, their expressions showing the kind of premature maturity that came from surviving in an adult world of danger and uncertainty. They understood that this wasn't the time for lengthy reunions or emotional expressions. "Veldar, we need to move." Kane's voice came through the communication link with increased urgency. "Guard rotation is early tonight. We have maybe 4 minutes before this place becomes a war zone." Mira stood, taking each daughter's hand while maintaining visual contact with the other children in the holding area. Her professional assessment was complete, but her maternal instincts were in direct conflict with her tactical responsibilities. Every fiber of her being wanted to focus exclusively on Lyra and Nova's safety, but she couldn't abandon the other young prisoners. "Kane, there are 40 children in this section," she reported. "We can't leave them." "I know," Kane replied, and she could hear weapons fire beginning in the distance. "Emergency evacuation protocol. Priority 1 medical cases first, then children, then mobile adults. But we have to start moving now." The next few minutes blurred into a chaos of movement, shouting, and the distinctive sound of energy weapons. Kane and the team fought a running battle through the facility's corridors while Mira and Dr. Yill guided streams of prisoners toward the extraction points. The children stayed close together, their shared terror creating a kind of group cohesion that made them easier to manage as a unit. Lyra and Nova remained beside Mira throughout the evacuation, their small hands gripping hers with the strength of survivors who had learned not to let go of safety when they found it. But they also helped with the younger children, using their empathic abilities to provide comfort and calm in the midst of terrifying chaos. The extraction transport was waiting at the designated coordinates, its cargo bay configured for emergency medical treatment and large-scale evacuation. As the last of the prisoners was loaded aboard, Mira finally allowed herself to embrace her daughters properly, feeling their solid reality against her chest and breathing in the scent that she had remembered through months of grief. "I'm sorry it took so long," she whispered into their hair. "I'm so sorry." "It's okay, Mama," Lyra said. "We knew you were coming. We just had to wait." As the transport lifted off and began its journey towards safety, Mira looked around the cargo bay at the dozens of prisoners they had rescued. Not all of them had found the specific people they might have hoped to save, but all of them represented restored possibilities, renewed hopes, and families that might yet be reunited. Kane found her as the transport entered hyperspace, settling beside the medical area where she was helping Dr. Yill assess the rescued children for immediate medical needs. "Good work in there," he said quietly. "You kept it together when a lot of people would have lost their focus." "I almost did lose it," Mira admitted. "When I first saw them, every instinct told me to forget about everyone else and just protect my own children. But you didn't," Kane pointed out. "You completed the assessment, you helped coordinate the evacuation, and you made sure no one was left behind. That's what makes the difference between a successful rescue and a tragedy." Mira looked down at Lyra and Nova, who had fallen asleep against her sides after being examined, and declared physically healthy. Around them, other rescued prisoners were beginning the long process of recovery, surrounded by the gentle activity of medical care and psychological support. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we take these people somewhere safe, help them start rebuilding their lives, and prepare for the next operation," Kane replied. "There are a lot more facilities out there, and a lot more people waiting for rescue." "Will you continue doing this work?" Kane nodded. "Until there's no one left to save, or until I can't do it anymore." "Someone has to." Mira understood now why he had been able to sustain this work for so long, operating behind enemy lines and facing impossible odds mission after mission. It wasn't about the specific people you hoped to find. It was about the people you could actually help, the lives you could actually save, the hope you could actually restore. "I'd like to continue working with your team," she said. "After Lyra and Nova are settled somewhere safe, I want to help with more operations. Even knowing how dangerous it is, even knowing that most missions won't end as well as this one did." Mira looked around the transport bay again, seeing not just her own children, but all the other survivors who would soon be reunited with their own families or help to build new ones. "Especially knowing that," she said, "because now I understand what we're really doing out here." Kane smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she had seen from him. Then, "Welcome to the team," he said. "I have a feeling we're going to need all the help we can get." Hashtag fifth document 6 months later, Mira stood in the observation deck of the Resistance base at Sanctuary Station, watching Lyra and Nova play with other children in the station's Central Park. The artificial environment provided Earth-normal gravity and a carefully maintained ecosystem that helped the young survivors begin to heal from their traumatic experiences. The girls had adapted to their new life with the resilience that children often displayed, but Mira knew the healing process would take years. They still had nightmares, still flinched at unexpected sounds, and their empathic abilities remained somewhat suppressed from months of being forced to hide their natural talents. But they laughed again, they asked questions about their new surroundings, and they had begun to trust that safety could be more than a temporary condition. "They're doing well," said Dr. Chun, the station's head of pediatric psychology, joining Mira at the observation window. "Their progress has been remarkable, especially considering the duration of their captivity." "They're stronger than I realized," Mira replied. "I spent so much time thinking about protecting them that I underestimated their ability to protect themselves." Through the transparent barrier, she watched Nova help a younger crystalline child navigate the climbing equipment, while Lyra organized a complex game that seemed to involve multiple species of children working together towards some shared objective. Their natural empathy, rather than being damaged by their experiences, had been refined into a tool for helping others feel safe and included. "The psychological evaluations show no signs of permanent trauma," Dr. Chun continued. "With continued support, they should develop into healthy, well-adjusted individuals. But, Mira, they're also going to have questions as they get older. Questions about why they were taken, what happened to their world, and what you were doing while they were imprisoned." Mira had been dreading those conversations, but she also understood their necessity. Lyra and Nova deserved to know the truth about the war, about loss, and about the choices people made when everything they loved was threatened. "I'll answer their questions honestly," she said, "when they're ready to hear the answers." Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "They'll also need to understand that what happened to them wasn't unique. There are thousands of other children who experienced similar captivity, and many who didn't survive or haven't been rescued yet. That knowledge will be difficult, but it will help them process their own experiences within a larger context." The reminder of other children still in captivity brought Myra's attention back to the present mission. In 2 hours, she would depart Sanctuary Station for her 8th rescue operation with Kane's team. The work had become both easier and harder as her experience grew. Easier because her skills had improved dramatically, harder because each mission reinforced how many people still needed help. "Mama, look what I made." Nova's voice carried across the park as she held up some kind of artistic creation involving colored crystals and metallic fibers. Mira waved back, feeling the familiar tug between her desire to stay with her daughters and her commitment to helping other families reunite. It was a balance she was still learning to manage, but Kane's guidance had been invaluable in finding a sustainable approach to the work. "The thing about rescue operations," Kane had explained after her 3rd mission, "is that you can't save everyone by yourself. But you can save everyone you're capable of saving, and you can help other people develop the capability to save even more." That philosophy had led to Myra's expanded role within the resistance networks. In addition to participating in active rescue missions, she had begun training other psychological assessment specialists, developing improved protocols for evaluating rescued prisoners, and helping establish support systems for families affected by the war. Her work had also led to an unexpected discovery about the scope of Draconic prison operations, the systematic nature of their captivity programs, the careful attention to psychological manipulation, and the strategic use of civilian prisoners as leverage all pointed to a coordinated campaign that went beyond simple military occupation. They're not just trying to control territory, Dr. Yill had observed during one of their intelligence analysis sessions. They're attempting to break the psychological foundation of entire species, make populations believe that resistance is futile, that cooperation with Draconic authority is the only path to survival. The revelation had crystallized Myra's understanding of why rescue operations were strategically important beyond their immediate humanitarian value. Every successful mission, every recovered prisoner, every family reunited represented a direct challenge to the Draconic psychological warfare campaign. Kane found her in the observation deck as departure time approached, carrying the gear pack that had become as familiar to her as her medical assessment equipment. Final mission briefing in Conference Room 3, he said. Intelligence suggests this one is going to be more complex than our usual operations. Mira took one last look at her daughters, who were now involved in what appeared to be an elaborate storytelling session with children from multiple species. They would be safe here, surrounded by people who understood their experiences and supported their recovery. More importantly, they would understand why their mother was leaving again. Not because she was abandoning them, but because she was working to prevent other children from experiencing what they had endured. The briefing room was crowded with familiar faces and several new ones. Kane's team had grown over the months, incorporating specialists from different resistance networks as their operations became more sophisticated and ambitious. The target this time is a maximum security facility in the Procyon system. Kane began manipulating the holographic display to show a heavily fortified installation built into the surface of a dead world. Long-range intelligence suggests it's being used as a processing center for prisoners before they're transferred to labor camps or research facilities. The implications were immediately clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't a holding facility where prisoners waited for ransom or political leverage. This was part of a systematic program to exploit civilian captives for various purposes. Estimated prisoner population is between 800 and 1,000 individuals, Kane continued. Mixed species, mixed ages, with an unusually high percentage of people with specialized skills. Engineers, scientists, medical personnel, and individuals with psychic or empathic abilities. Mira felt a chill of recognition. Zephyrians with empathic talents, crystalline resonance engineers, insectoid hive coordinators. The Draconics were specifically targeting individuals whose abilities could be useful for their expansion efforts. Security is approximately 5 times heavier than anything we've attempted before, Dr. Yill added, her crystalline form chiming with harmonic concern. Military-grade defensive systems, enhanced guard patrols, and what appears to be experimental detention technology designed to suppress psychic abilities. So why are we considering this operation? Asked Vex, the insectoid communications specialist. The risk assessment has to be astronomical. Kane was quiet for a moment, studying the holographic facility with the intense focus he brought to all tactical planning. Because intelligence indicates they're planning to transfer the majority of prisoners within the next 2 weeks, he said finally. Once they're moved to permanent labor installations or research facilities, rescue becomes virtually impossible. This is likely our only opportunity to reach these specific individuals. And because, added a new voice from the back of the room, one of those individuals is someone we've been trying to locate for over a year. Mira turned to see Commander Thorne entering the briefing room, his massive ursine frame requiring the others to shift positions to accommodate him. "Ooh," Kane asked. Human xenopsychologist who was working on psychological resistance techniques when her research station was overrun. Her work on maintaining mental stability under extreme stress could be critical for improving survival rates among rescued prisoners. The room fell silent as the implications settled in. Dr. Vasquez wasn't just another prisoner to be rescued. She was someone whose knowledge could directly improve their ability to save other people. More than that, Thorne continued, she was working on something the Draconics definitely don't want us to have, techniques for psychological resistance to coercion and manipulation. If they're holding her for research purposes, they're trying to reverse engineer her work to improve their own psychological warfare capabilities. Kane studied the facility schematics with renewed intensity. What's the intelligence confidence level on her presence at this facility? 75%, Thorne replied. Multiple independent sources have reported seeing a human female matching her description among the prisoners being processed through this installation. And the other 25%? Mira asked. She's already been transferred elsewhere. She's been killed, or the identification was mistaken, Thorne said bluntly. But even if Dr. Vasquez isn't there, the other prisoners still deserve rescue if we can manage it. Kane turned to address the full team. This is going to be our most dangerous operation to date. Significantly higher risk than anything we've attempted, with success probabilities that would normally make me recommend against attempting the mission at all. He paused, making eye contact with each team member. I'm not ordering anyone to participate in this operation. If you want to sit this one out, no one will question your decision or think less of your commitment to the cause. Mira found herself thinking about Lyra and Nova playing safely in the park just a few levels below this conference room. She had found them, saved them, and given them the chance to heal and grow into the people they were meant to become. The rational choice would be to focus on that success and avoid risking everything on an operation with such uncertain prospects. But she also thought about the 800 to 1,000 prisoners trapped in that facility, waiting for rescue that might never come. Someone's children, parents, siblings, friends, people with their own dreams and fears and loved ones hoping for their return. I'm in, she said quietly. One by one, the others voiced their commitment to the mission. Even knowing the risks, even understanding that some of them might not return, they were willing to attempt what might be impossible for the sake of people they had never met. The night before departure, she video called Lyra and Nova from the team's staging area. The girls had been briefed about this mission's increased danger level, and they understood that there was a possibility their mother might not return. Are you scared, Mama? Nova asked, her amber eyes serious in the holographic display. Yes, sweetheart, Mira replied honestly. But sometimes being scared means you're doing something important. Will the people you're trying to save be happy when you find them? Lyra asked. I hope so, Mira said. But mostly, I hope they'll be free. Sometimes that's enough. The girls were quiet for a moment, and Mira could sense them communicating empathically with each other in the way that Zephyrian siblings often did. We love you, Mama, they said in unison. Come home safe. I love you too, she replied. More than all the stars in the galaxy. As the connection ended, Mira felt the weight of everything she was risking balanced against everything she hoped to accomplish. In a few hours, she would embark on a mission that might save hundreds of lives or might result in the loss of her own life and the lives of her teammates. But as she looked around at the other team members making their own final preparations, checking equipment, reviewing tactical plans, saying goodbye to their own loved ones, she understood that this was what it meant to be part of something larger than personal happiness or individual survival. Kane found her in the equipment bay as she completed her final gear check. Ready, he asked. Ready, she replied. Together, they boarded the stealth transport that would carry them toward the most dangerous mission any of them had ever attempted. As the ship departed Sanctuary Station and headed for the Procyon system, Mira thought about all the paths that had led to this moment. The loss of her homeworld, the grief of believing her children were dead, the slow rebuilding of hope and purpose, and the discovery that sometimes the most meaningful victories came from helping others find their own paths to safety. Whatever happened the next few days, she had become someone she could respect, a person who chose to act when action was needed, who accepted risk for the sake of others' freedom, and who understood that love meant more than protecting what you already had. The stars ahead looked like possibilities rather than distant, uncaring lights. And somewhere among them, hundreds of prisoners waited for rescue, not knowing that 30 determined individuals were coming.